Hi guys, welcome back. What if the 1800s, the age of top hats, telegrams, and moral perfection hid one of history's most secret kinds of love? Behind the lace curtains and strict manners letters passed between men and women who could never speak their feelings aloud. Poets wrote about friendship that burned too bright to be innocent. Soldiers shared beds during long campaigns. Artists and aristocrats kept quiet relationships in plain sight, hidden behind polite society's smiles. But how did they survive in a world where exposure meant ruin? Were they rebels, romantics, or just people trying to live unseen? The clues remain in diaries, court records, and coded love poems that history almost erased. Tell me the time you're watching Morning Night or somewhere in between. And if you want history told without filters, the way it truly was, hit subscribe, no pressure. Now, let's begin. You arrive in the 1800s, an era so polished it squeaks when it walks. Lace collars, candlelight empire waistlines, and the kind of politeness that could suffocate a horse. Yet beneath that polished surface hums another world, quiet and electric, hidden in glances and coded laughter. You can almost feel it, this strange tension between decorum and desire, between corseted appearances and what the human heart actually wants. It's London first, where the gas lamps hiss, and the fog doesn't just swallow streets, it swallows secrets. You stroll down Pall Mall, the smell of damp cobblestone clinging to your boots. The men in top hats exchange subtle nods, a glance that lingers just half a beat too long. Nothing more, nothing less. Because here in the age of empire, love between men isn't simply forbidden, it's unspeakable. To name it is to ruin lives, to summon police raids and scandal sheets. So instead of open affection, the people of this hidden world master the art of suggestion. A flower pinned just so. A handkerchief folded the wrong way round. A code that only the lonely seem to understand. You'd think such repression would kill desire. But history says otherwise. Humans have a habit of building cathedrals from what they're denied. So in the absence of freedom, queer life in the 19th century becomes almost theatrical. Behind curtains and in smoky taverns, people invent languages of looks, of silence, of shadows. Some dress in ways that blur the line between male and female, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of joy. Others gather in secret houses where for a few stolen hours they can dance, drink, and exist without the crushing weight of respectability. Even the poets and aristocrats aren't immune. Take Lord Byron, for instance. He had a reputation for sleeping with everyone and everything that moved, and a few things that didn't. His love letters to men were burned by relatives after his death. But whispers of them survived, fluttering through the salons of Europe like scandalous butterflies. When someone once accused him of unspeakable sins, Byron merely shrugged and said, "I cannot repent of what I do not consider a sin." You can almost hear the defiance in his voice, half bravado, half weary truth. But it's not just the famous. Imagine a young servant polishing silver in a manor house, feeling something he can't name for the footman beside him. Or two women running a boarding house together for 20 years, quietly sharing a bed. No one questions. History rarely wrote their names, but you can sense them between the lines of census records, in the euphemisms of companions and roommates. Of course, you can't stay in the shadows forever. The 1800s is an age obsessed with morality, with labeling everything proper. Queen Victoria's reign turns the empire into a giant etiquette manual. Anything orthodox becomes a threat to social order. You might think that makes life unbearable, but there's irony in it too. The more society insists on purity, the more secret lives bloom underneath like mushrooms in the dark. And yet there's humor in the way repression twists itself into knots. In 1885, British lawmakers passed a law banning gross indecency between males. The wording was so vague it didn't even define the crime, because writing down what they feared might corrupt the public mind. So they criminalized an act they couldn't bring themselves to describe. You can't help but laugh at the absurdity a law made from blushes and hypocrisy. This was an age where even furniture had double meanings. In Paris, there were cafes rumored to host special clientele. In Berlin, certain barbershops had signals mirrors tilted at a specific angle, a blue flower in the window that said, "You're safe here." And in London, a particular public urinal near the Strand was infamous as a meeting spot, so much so that police posted informants disguised as janitors. You can imagine the tension of it all, the risk, the excitement, the endless pretending. Yet, through it all, love persists. Perhaps that's the most quietly heroic thing about this hidden century. Beneath the starched shirts and rigid laws, people still find ways to care for each other, to write letters in code, to hold hands when no one's watching, to live however briefly in truth. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear them. The laughter muffled behind fans, the quick footsteps in foggy alleys, the whispers that history nearly forgot. These were not just people hiding. They were people surviving. People writing the first invisible chapters of what would one day become a visible history. And while the empire itself struts in marble halls and military uniforms, you stand in the velvet shadows with those who loved differently and dared to remain human in a world that tried to erase them. You lean closer to the flickering candlelight, the smell of ink and sealing wax heavy in the air. Paper rustles like a heartbeat. In the 1800s, love between men and women of the same sex couldn't be shouted aloud, but it could be written. Carefully, secretly, sometimes beautifully, and sometimes even accidentally. Letters became both a lifeline and a trap. They were how affection survived in an age of silence. Yet each word was a loaded weapon, because a single sheet of paper found in the wrong hands could destroy a reputation forever. You can almost feel the tremor in the fingers of someone writing, "My dearest friend," when what they truly mean is "my beloved." One of the most famous examples comes from Anne Lister, the English landowner whose diaries fill more than 4 million words. Some of them written in a secret code she devised herself. Her entries describe flirtations, heartbreaks, and relationships with women in astonishing detail. When her neighbors saw her walking briskly through Halifax in her tailored black coat, they nicknamed her Gentleman Jack. She didn't seem to mind. She once wrote, "I love and only love the fairer sex." You can almost imagine her smirking as she wrote it, daring the future to judge her. But not everyone had Anne's courage or her financial security. For most, writing meant hiding their heart behind metaphors. Poets like Walt Whitman poured their longing into lines that could be read 2 ways. His Calamus poems spoke of adhesive love, a term so tender it sounded almost medical. Yet his admirers understood. "We 2 boys together clinging," he wrote one the other, "never leaving." The critics at the time brushed it off as manly friendship. You almost want to laugh. It's the politest act of denial in literary history. Writers learned to cloak meaning under the finest silk of language. Oscar Wilde would later perfect this art. But even decades before him, coded affection was everywhere. A man might write, "You are my soul's twin," and the reader, if they were in on it, would feel the weight of what went unsaid. Words became a shared disguise, a secret handshake passed between souls. You think of how strange that must have felt to live in a world where love itself had to be encrypted. It's like trying to write poetry underwater, every letter blurring and dissolving, but still refusing to disappear. Even scientists got tangled in the subtext. The naturalist Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, one of the first people to publicly speak about same-sex desire, coined the term "urning" to describe a male soul in a male body. He sent his pamphlets out across Europe in secret envelopes, knowing that every copy risked arrest. Still, he wrote, "I am proud to be an urning." It's a small sentence, but it feels like a thunderclap in the silence. Of course, not all letters were so careful. The archives of European police departments are filled with confiscated notes, sometimes tragic, sometimes hilarious. In one British trial from the 1870s, prosecutors read aloud a man's love letter as proof of indecency. It wasn't explicit at all, just tender. The courtroom laughed at words like, "my sweet boy," as if affection itself were a crime. You can almost see the man's face standing there as his heart is turned into evidence. And yet paper is stubborn. It outlives shame. Centuries later, we find these letters again in archives tied with faded ribbon edges, browned by time. What was once dangerous is now precious. The same lines that could have destroyed a life now illuminate it. History, as always, has a sense of irony. You might even recognize something familiar in it. Think of today how messages sent in secrecy still carry the same trembling thrill. The fear of exposure has simply changed shape. Back then, it was a maid intercepting the post. Now, it's an unread message sitting on a glowing screen. The tools evolve, but the human heart refuses to. And oh, the creativity of concealment. Lovers wrote with invisible ink made from lemon juice, which could be revealed only by holding the paper near a flame. They composed poems where every first letter of each line formed hidden words. They exchanged books with passages underlined, creating a code that only the two of them could decipher. Imagine walking past someone in a ballroom pretending to be strangers, while knowing that in your pocket rests a note that could ruin or save you. Even across continents, the pulse continued. In the colonies, officers and explorers sent letters home that hinted at deep comradeship. Some historians now suspect those stiffly worded phrases were anything but platonic. After all, when you're months at sea or years in the jungle, loneliness has a way of rearranging moral boundaries. But they never wrote it plainly. They couldn't. So they wrote about loyalty, admiration, unbreakable bonds. A century later, you read between the lines, and the truth glows through like candlelight behind old paper. There's something heartbreakingly human about it all. The sheer effort it took just to say, "I miss you." The risk of a sentence. The courage to write, even when the world said you shouldn't exist. You start to realize that these letters aren't just love stories. They're acts of rebellion pressed into envelopes and sealed with trembling wax. And somewhere you picture a hand hesitating over a final line, a drop of ink swelling like a heartbeat before falling. The writer folds the paper, presses it shut, and hopes it reaches the right person. That hope, that fragile, stubborn hope, is what kept love alive in a century determined to erase it. You wake to the sound of boots echoing down narrow streets. The world outside has changed. The whispers of love that once hid behind poetry and letters now face something colder law. The 1800s, with all its lace and civility, is about to show its iron teeth. You can almost feel the chill of authority in the air. As the century marches forward, moral panic tightens its grip. Governments across Europe begin sharpening their definitions of decency. And because society can't stand what it doesn't understand, it decides to legislate it. You'd think lawmakers would have bigger problems, famine, war, empire. But no. The idea that two men might care for each other somehow becomes a national emergency. Let's start with Britain, because it wrote the playbook. In 1885, Parliament passed what became known as the Labouchere Amendment part of the Criminal Law Amendment Act. It made gross indecency between males illegal, an elastic phrase so vague it could mean almost anything. There didn't need to be evidence of an act, just suspicion. One letter, one rumor, one servant's testimony could ruin a life. Ironically, Queen Victoria herself refused to sign an equivalent law against women, allegedly saying, "No such thing exists." It's almost comical homosexuality apparently could be abolished by royal disbelief. You can picture the atmosphere's smoky courtrooms, reporters licking their pencils, the accused trembling under cross-examination. The judge frowning with theatrical disgust, the jury pretending to faint. It's morality as performance art. But the consequences are no act. Men are imprisoned, careers destroyed, families disgraced. The public reads about it in newspapers, between war bulletins and horse races. Scandal cells. Across the Channel, France has a slightly different tune. After the Revolution, Napoleon's penal code omitted any laws against same-sex relations, technically making France one of the few European countries without such bans. Sounds enlightened, doesn't it? But don't be fooled. Police still raided gathering places, still kept secret lists, still ruined lives quietly without the bother of trials. It's repression without paperwork. Meanwhile, in Germany, the infamous paragraph 175 arrives in 1871. It criminalizes unnatural indecency between men, a phrase that would outlive empires. You could be a decorated soldier, a respected teacher, a quiet bookkeeper, and still find yourself in a cell for a private moment of tenderness. The Prussian state prided itself on order, and what could be more chaotic in its eyes than human desire? You can sense how fear begins to reshape society. Men avoid friendship that looks too close. Women who share homes are whispered about. Even art changes. Painters remove touch, writers dull their metaphors. Actors moderate their gestures. The world tightens its collar and looks away. And yet the harder the law squeezes, the more inventive the heart becomes. Hidden meeting spots multiply. In London, there are molly houses, taverns, and private rooms where men meet in secret. Police reports describe them with scandalized fascination, men in wigs, dancing, laughing, calling each other by feminine nicknames. The authorities saw decadence. History sees resilience. Sometimes the persecution reaches absurd heights. In one documented case, a young man in Dublin was accused of suspicious walking because he strolled through a park too often. No witness, no act, just vibes. He was acquitted, thankfully, but the newspapers made sure his name was known. You wonder how many people after him stopped walking that same path, afraid their footsteps might be mistaken for confession. This is how law works. In that century, it doesn't just punish, it teaches fear. It convinces you to police yourself. You begin to understand why people of that time became masters of disguise. A gentleman could sit in Parliament by day and sneak into secret clubs by night. A maid could write tender poems to another woman and hide them in a Bible. Survival required choreography. And then came Oscar Wilde. The world remembers his wit, his velvet jackets, his impossible charm. But it was his trial in 1895 that tore away the last veil. Charged under that same gross indecency law, Wilde stood in court and, rather than deny, defended love as the love that dare not speak its name. For a brief, dazzling moment, beauty confronted hypocrisy. And hypocrisy is always won. 2 years of hard labor broke him. Yet his words outlive the sentence. Each man kills the thing he loves, he once wrote. You can't help but think he knew that from experience. It's tempting to look back and judge them, to wonder why no one rebelled sooner. But you have to remember, rebellion wasn't always loud. Sometimes it looked like a coded note or a smile that refused to fade. Sometimes it was simply living one more day without apology. So you picture yourself walking those streets again, past the carriages and shop windows, under posters declaring moral reform. You feel the weight of the laws, invisible but suffocating. And yet, somewhere in the distance, a laugh rings out from behind a shuttered window, a sound that shouldn't exist, but does anyway. That's the paradox of this century. Every law meant to erase love only proves it existed in the first place. Fog presses against the gas lamps of London like damp wool. You hear the clop of horses, the jingle of harnesses, the distant hiss of steam trains, yet beneath it all hums something secret. The year is somewhere in the mid-1800s, and this city with its coal smoke and carriages, its grandeur and grime, hides more stories than it can ever tell. You think you know Victorian London, prudish, polished morale to the marrow. But wait until you see what happens after midnight, when the empire's heart of virtue starts to beat to another rhythm entirely. You drift through Soho, where the fog smells faintly of gin and regret. The pubs here aren't just pubs, they're theaters of disguise. A man might stroll in wearing a crisp cravat, order a drink, and slip into a back room where a conversation changes dialect. By day he's a clerk or barrister. By night he's part of an invisible brotherhood bound not by name, but by recognition. A raised eyebrow, a tap on the bar, the smallest brush of a hand, all tiny signals in a language older than law. These hidden corners became what the newspapers of the day sneeringly called molly houses. The police described them as dens of depravity. But if you walked in without judgment, you'd see something else entirely: joy. Men dancing in petticoats, yes, but also laughter, tenderness, storytelling. A place where for a few hours the world's rules dissolved and people breathed freely. The raids would come, the arrests would follow. But somehow the next week, the same laughter returned. It's remarkable, isn't it, how persistence can outlast punishment? You might picture one of those figures now, a tailor from Whitechapel who saves a few pennies for his Friday disguise, or a messenger boy who slips in to watch, not to join, just to feel that flicker of belonging. These were not flamboyant rebels, they were survivors. In a society built on appearances, invisibility became their armor. Outside respectability strutted in top hats and sermon tones. But inside, under gaslight, a quiet revolution brewed. People formed coded circles, the Uranian poets with their discreet sonnets, the aesthetes with their brotherhood of beauty, the men who met in Hyde Park at dusk, pretending to discuss politics, while their eyes told other stories. The police pretended not to notice until the newspapers needed a scandal. One of the most famous raids happened in 1880 at a club in Cleveland Street. It was run by a man named Charles Hammond, and its clientele included telegraph boys, nobles, even members of Parliament. When the scandal broke, the government panicked, not because of the acts themselves, but because exposure threatened the illusion of moral superiority on which the empire prided itself. A few arrests were made, then quietly buried. It was the Victorian way, hypocrisy wrapped in a sermon, tied with a ribbon of silence. You imagine wandering along the Thames afterward. The river smells metallic and fog curls around your boots. Somewhere near the embankment stands a solitary gas lamp. Under it, two figures linger just a little too long before parting ways. It's tender, not tawdry, though the tabloids would insist otherwise. The entire century seems obsessed with pretending that love is only noble when it fits the rulebook. But London, that vast machine of contradictions, keeps creating spaces where rulebooks burn. And oh, the coded talk. There was a whole lexicon of the underground. The sisterhood, they called it. Camp queer Molly's words, born from mockery that later became badges of defiance. The language of survival has always been clever. Like that, it turns insults into armor. Sometimes, amid all the repression, there's dark humor. One police report complained that plainclothes officers could not apprehend the suspects, for they had all exchanged attire. You can't help but laugh, half the force of the law undone by borrowed corsets and wigs. History doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it just trips over its own absurdity. You pause by a newsstand. Headlines scream about moral decline. Yet the same papers quietly profit from voyeuristic curiosity. The Pall Mall Gazette prints exposés about immorality in the city, while its editors sell record copies. Scandal, as it turns out, is good business. Still among the grime and hypocrisy, something quietly sacred takes shape. A culture of coded courage. People memorize escape routes, memorize looks. Some even start sketching each other's small portraits hidden in drawers. Face is captured not for vanity, but for proof that we existed. Imagine that needing a portrait, not to be remembered, but to confirm your reality in a world that insists you don't exist at all. The streets themselves seem to conspire in secrecy alleys named half-moon court taverns called the Blue Posts, and private rooms that lock with hidden bolts. London unknowingly becomes a map of resistance. And though no one will call it that, yet you can sense it, the faint hum of solidarity of people who refuse to vanish entirely. You can almost hear it now, laughter echoing off damp brick walls, the rustle of silk borrowed for disguise, the nervous heartbeat of those who choose love over safety. The fog thickens, the lamps glow dim, and you walk on past the policemen, past the sermons, into the living pulse of a city that's far more human than its laws. Paris doesn't hide its secrets, it dances with them. You cross the Channel and step into a city that smells of tobacco, wine, and rebellion. Here everything feels louder, brighter, more unapologetically alive. If London is a locked diary, Paris is an open confession written in perfume and laughter. You arrive in Montmartre, the bohemian hill where art and vice share a table and toast each other with cheap champagne. The lamps burn yellow against the mist, and accordion music drifts through the air like smoke. You glance into a cabaret, maybe the Chat Noir or the Moulin Rouge, and see a blur of velvet skirts, painted eyes, and the kind of joy that only exists when people stop pretending. On stage, men dress as women, women as men, and the crowd cheers not in scandal, but in delight. It's a carnival of inversion, temporary, risky, but intoxicating. France had long abandoned the old sodomy laws after the Revolution. So technically what happens here isn't a crime, but technically doesn't mean safe. The police keep lists. The press invents moral panic when sales drop. Still, for a few decades, there's breathing space, a fragile window where queer lives can bloom before science and scandal slam it shut again. You wander into the smoky heart of Le Monocle, a club known for its women in tuxedos and short hair, what polite society calls inverties. They dance together beneath a huge glittering mirror. One of them catches your eye and winks. You feel both welcome and warned. These women build a world that refuses definition. To outsiders, they're an oddity. To each other, they're proof that freedom exists, even if only until dawn. The cafes of the left bank hum with the chatter of writers who, knowingly or not, build the modern language of love. Baudelaire, Verlaine, Rimbaud, their verses bleed with intoxication, jealousy, tenderness between men. Rimbaud once wrote to Verlaine, "Come, dear great soul, we call each other and we go." He was 17. Verlaine was married. Their affair was chaos, ending with a pistol shot and prison. But out of that wreckage came poetry that still smells of sweat, gunpowder, and longing. You wonder how much art was born, not despite taboo, but because of it. There's something different in the air here. Paris doesn't sanctify love, it scandalizes it. And maybe that's what makes it freer. Behind the velvet curtains of salons and artist lofts, same-sex desire finds language, brushstrokes, and rhythm. You walk past a studio where Henri Toulouse-Lautrec sketches cabaret performers, men in makeup, women in suits, the lines between them blurring into elegance. Nearby, Sarah Bernhardt, the most famous actress in the world, lounges in a man's suit, cigarette between her fingers, smiling like she knows every secret ever whispered. She famously kept female lovers and shrugged when questioned, saying, "My heart is like the sea. It contains many fish." You can't help but admire the audacity. But Paris is not all glitter. Outside the cafes, the city grows darker. The working-class quarters are full of soldiers, sailors, and laborers who find their own coded corners. The docks along the Seine become a theater of stolen moments, kisses traded between men who'll never speak of it again. Some do it for money, some for company, some for the quiet thrill of being seen. It's messy, human, and real. Meanwhile, the police try to catalog the unclassifiable. Files appear, dossiers labeled pederastes, full of addresses, descriptions, occupations. The state may have abandoned punishment, but it hasn't abandoned surveillance. It's the same hypocrisy in a new suit fascination disguised as morality. Still, art keeps pushing boundaries. Painters like Gustave Courbet and Jean Delville fill their canvases with mythic, sensual bodies, quietly celebrating what religion calls forbidden. The symbolists turn desire into allegory, creating gods and angels who look suspiciously like the men in the audience. Paris, always ahead of its time, teaches the world that repression can't kill beauty, it just changes its costume. You think of modern parallels. The drag shows, the underground clubs, the way cities today still pulse with secret languages. Isn't it strange how history keeps repeating, not like a mirror, but like a rhythm? What they whispered under candlelight, people now post with cautious emojis. The technology changes. The courage doesn't. In the Belle Epoque's glow, queer love briefly steps out of the shadows, not loudly, not safely, but visibly enough to leave footprints. You imagine two men walking home through narrow streets after a masquerade, masks still in hand. The dawn light makes their sequins look like armor. One laughs softly, saying something you can't quite hear. Maybe a promise, maybe just a joke. Either way, for that fleeting moment, they're free. And that, perhaps, is the most revolutionary act of all in a century that worships constraint to love, even quietly, without shame. The sea wind smells like iron and salt as you sail across the Atlantic, leaving the glitter of Europe behind. The year is drifting toward the late 1800s, and on the other side lies America, a land that prides itself on freedom, yet struggles to define what that word truly means. You dock in New York first, where ambition and loneliness live side by side like mismatched roommates. The city hums with invention, streetcars, electric bulbs, jazz beginnings. But under its bright new energy lingers the same old rule: the heart must behave. There are no official laws against same-sex relationships in most states yet, but society itself is law enough. Morality pamphlets are handed out on corners. Churches preach against unmanly affections. You can feel the tension, a country young enough to imagine anything, but already afraid of its own imagination. Still, love finds its loopholes. In parlors and tenement rooms, in university dorms, and army barracks, bonds form that history would later call romantic friendships. The phrase sounds delicate, doesn't it? A polite disguise for passion. Two men sharing rooms for decades. Two women buried side by side. The world called them companions, spinsters, roommates. But if you look closer, you see devotion that no euphemism can quite cover. You visit the home of Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake, who lived together in Vermont from 1807 until their deaths, their neighbors calling them the ladies. Their partnership lasted 44 years, and the local church recorded them as a married couple in all but name. You can almost picture them sewing by lamplight, finishing each other's sentences, and daring the town's curiosity to grow tired before their love did. In Boston, meanwhile, the poet Emily Dickinson writes letters to her friend Susan Gilbert that throb with tenderness, come to me tonight and every night. Scholars still debate their meaning as if centuries of male editors simply can't imagine that a woman might have loved another woman that much. You smile at that, how history insists on calling passion friendship when it wears the wrong dress. Across America, something quietly radical is taking shape. The idea that affection between the same sex could be dignified, even noble. The Boston marriages of educated women, many teachers, writers, reformers, gave them both emotional and financial independence. They lived together often in pairs, running schools, founding charities, and traveling abroad. The public, unsure how to label them, looked the other way. You can almost hear the whispered calculations, 2 unmarried women. Perhaps it's just practical. And that polite blindness became their freedom. The same pattern emerges among men, though cloaked in military camaraderie and artistic brotherhood. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass continues to spread its quiet revolution. When asked about the manly love in his poems, he simply smiled and said, "I have written what I have written." It's the kind of answer that both hides and reveals everything. His readers, especially soldiers returning from the Civil War, found in his words a reflection of the bonds they couldn't name. The trenches had made them intimate with death. Whitman gave them permission to be intimate with life. You travel next to the Midwest, where industrial towns grow faster than morals can keep up. Boarding houses, filled with single men who work together, live together, and often share one narrow bed to save money. Historians call it economic necessity, but you sense that not all warmth in those rooms came from practicality. People are always inventing new excuses for affection. And then there's New Orleans, ever the exception, ever the masquerade. In this port city, sailors, Creoles, and freedmen create a blend of culture the rest of America doesn't quite understand. The French Quarter becomes its own little Paris music, drink, and danger. During Mardi Gras, men in satin dresses walk openly down the street, masks, concealing only names, not intentions. No one asks questions, at least not until Lent arrives and virtue returns with the hangover. You can't help but notice the irony. Europe criminalized love through its courts. America policed it through silence. No prisons, just erasure. But sometimes silence is more brutal than bars. To exist meant to pretend to let history call you a lifelong friend and hope someone somewhere would read between the lines. And yet, you find tenderness everywhere. A photograph from the 1870s shows 2 young men, arms linked, gazing directly into the camera. Their expressions are calm, almost defiant. They couldn't have known that one day their picture would be studied as evidence of early queer affection. They were just 2 people trying to preserve a moment. Another image shows 2 women in starched collars, one resting her hand gently on the other's shoulder. The caption reads only, "Together, 1888. Sometimes that single word is enough. You pause to imagine them, these unnamed lovers of the Gilded Age, watching trains depart, exchanging pressed flowers, composing letters they'll never dare to send. It's heartbreak, yes, but also something beautiful, proof that love is like water. It fills whatever space it's given. So you keep walking down the brick streets of this new world, hearing the clatter of typewriters and trolley bells, feeling the pulse of a society rushing toward modernity, but dragging its fear behind it. America, like Europe, is a place of contradictions, freedom on paper, restraint in practice. But under that shiny surface, another America hums a quieter one, built of devotion, too stubborn to die. You think the 1800s belonged only to Europe and America, but listen closely, and you'll hear the heartbeats of other worlds, beating beneath colonial boots, singing love songs that empires tried to silence. You travel east now, away from gaslight and opera houses, into lands where tradition once held its own rhythms of intimacy. The British Empire stretches like a shadow across continents, bringing with it railways, rifles, and less visibly, its laws. In its luggage, the Victorian moral code polished to a shine of righteousness. Where it lands, old customs vanish. Your first stop is India, where before the colonizers arrived, the world of gender and desire was far more fluid. Ancient Hindu texts spoke of third genders and divine dualities. Temples once depicted lovers of all kinds carved in stone unashamed. But in 1861, the British wrote Section 377 into the Indian Penal Code, criminalizing carnal intercourse against the order of nature. You can almost hear the ink drying, the sound of centuries of culture being rewritten overnight. The law would survive long after the empire itself crumbled. You imagine a court in Calcutta ceiling fans, whirring a British magistrate declaring a man unnatural. Behind the language of justice lurks arrogance, the belief that Western morality is universal. But nature, as always, doesn't sign treaties. Desire still flickers in hidden rooms, under palm fronds, in quiet courtyards. Some scholars whisper of friendships between colonial officers and their Indian assistants, relationships written out of official reports, but hinted at in private letters. The irony is almost unbearable. The empire that criminalized love often practiced it in secret. From India, you move toward Africa, where missionary schools rewrite the world line by line. Traditional same-sex bonds, once woven into initiation rites, warrior brotherhoods, and community roles, are condemned as sinful. Yet oral histories preserve them. Among the Nandi in Kenya, female husbands take wives to maintain family lineage. In some parts of the continent, intimate partnerships between men existed long before Europeans drew their borders. But the new preachers and administrators arrive with Bibles in one hand and criminal codes in the other. And they rewrite not just religion, but memory. The Pacific tells a similar story. In Samoa, the Fa'afafine people born male but living as women were respected, even cherished. In Hawaii, pre-colonial society had the concept of Icane same-sex companions among chiefs. Love was not taboo, it was tradition. But by the late 1800s, missionaries arrive armed with the moral vocabulary of Victorian England. Savagery, they call it. Perversion. You can feel the cultural amnesia setting in the erasure, working like acid. There's an almost tragic irony to it all. The empire claimed to bring light to the dark corners of the world, but in truth, it dimmed the lights that were already there. The native languages of affection and identity, complex, spiritual, beautiful, were replaced with imported shame. You can imagine the confusion of someone told that their way of being accepted for generations is now a crime punishable by prison. Still resistance brews quietly. In port cities, Calcutta, Cape Town, Manila, Hong Kong, sailors and traders create microcosms of freedom. On the docks, identities blur. Men wear earrings, women wear trousers, and nobody asks too many questions. Global trade does what no sermon can stop. It mixes people desires and possibilities. You can all smell the sweat and salt, hear the polyglot laughter. History might not record their names, but their stories float in the sea air. And within the empire's own ranks, contradiction thrives. British officers stationed abroad often live double lives upholding morality in reports, while indulging in the very vices they condemn. Diaries of explorers and anthropologists hint at this hypocrisy. The famous Sir Richard Burton, translator of the Kama Sutra, secretly documented same-sex customs in the Middle East and Africa, calling them the sotatic zone. He couldn't publish his findings openly, of course, but he kept meticulous notes, half scientific, half personal curiosity. You wonder how much of his fascination was observation and how much recognition. Colonialism didn't just suppress it, exported shame like a product, stamping it on laws that would last for centuries. Even after independence, those same penal codes remained as if the empire's ghost had signed the Constitution. You see it still today, the echoes of Victorian morality surviving long after the Victorians themselves turned to dust. And yet beneath the layers of conquest and code, something endures. The local traditions, the older stories, they don't vanish completely. They survive in songs, in rituals, in the quiet persistence of people who refuse to forget who they are. You can almost hear them, the whispered prayers at night, the small gestures of defiance, the shared laughter that colonial laws could never quite erase. Maybe that's the lesson of this journey across oceans. The heart, no matter where it beats, always finds a language. Empires can rewrite laws, but they can't rewrite longing. So you sail onward, watching the colonial ports fade into the horizon, their harbors glittering with both cruelty and courage. Behind you lies a world rewritten. Ahead waits another one that will soon try to redefine love in the language of science. The world smells different now, of formaldehyde, disinfectant, and chalk dust. You've entered the laboratories and lecture halls of the late 19th century, where morality puts on a white coat and calls itself science. The candlelight of secret letters and cabaret nights gives way to the glare of gas lamps above medical tables. The age of emotion is being replaced by the age of classification. The first thing you notice is the certainty. Every man with a microscope believes he's staring at the truth. But what they're really staring at is fear dressed up as discovery. The Victorians can't stop talking about progress, yet when it comes to desire, they start marching backward. Love becomes pathology. Passion becomes specimen. In Germany, a man named Karl Heinrich Ulrichs begins to fight back. Before anyone else dares, he writes pamphlets arguing that same-sex desire is not a vice, but a natural variation. He calls those who feel it earningsmen with a female soul in a male body. It's clumsy language by today's standards, but revolutionary in his time. In 1867, he stands before a congress of German jurists and declares trembling but resolute, "I am proud to be an Urning." The hall erupts in outrage. He's shouted down, booed off stage, but history remembered him as the world's first openly gay activist. Yet while Ulrichs argues for understanding, other doctors sharpen their scalpels. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, an Austrian psychiatrist, publishes Psychopathia Sexualis in 1886, a book filled with case studies that labels same-sex attraction a perversion. It sells out in weeks. Ironically, he claims to be studying abnormality. But in doing so, he documents an entire subculture, diaries, letters, confessions that otherwise would have been lost. Each case he lists is a life forced into scientific Latin. A poet who loves his friend becomes case 145, male inversion of affectional instinct. You can almost hear the cold pen scratching away humanity. Then comes Magnus Hirschfeld, another German doctor who dares to challenge that cruelty. He collects thousands of personal histories, studying people with compassion instead of contempt. He coins the term transvestite not as insult, but as description. He argues that gender and sexuality exist on a spectrum. His Institute for Sexual Science, founded in Berlin in 1897, becomes a sanctuary for those the world calls unnatural. Photographs show him smiling with his staff doctors, patients, even artists, all working toward understanding. It feels like a fragile miracle. Of course, not everyone shares that spirit. Across Europe, medical theories begin leaking into the law. Judges start quoting psychiatrists to justify punishment. One man is sentenced to treatment instead of jail. Another is committed to an asylum for life. Rehabilitation, they call it. You can almost feel the irony burn. The state no longer calls it sin, it calls it science. But the cage is the same shape. Still, the conversation shifts. What was once moral panic becomes a medical debate, and debates unlike panics can be argued. The human heart, once condemned from the pulpit, now takes its chances under a microscope. You wonder if that's progress or just a different kind of prison. Science's gaze spreads beyond Europe. Anthropologists begin cataloging sexual customs of colonized people with the same fascination they reserve for butterflies. Their tone is clinical. Their motives mixed part curiosity, part control. Sir Richard Burton, ever the adventurer, maps the sototic zone, claiming same-sex behavior thrives in tropical climates, as though love were a disease spread by humidity. It's laughable now, but at the time, it gave empire yet another excuse to moralize. Even the arts feel the tremor of this new knowledge. Writers start describing characters not as sinners, but patients. Novels whisper about inverts and unnatural instincts. The word homosexual itself appears for the first time in 1869, coined by a Hungarian journalist, Karl Maria Kertbeny, who wanted to humanize those like himself, but the term quickly becomes a label, a diagnosis, something to categorize rather than understand. You can almost feel the moment language shifts. The love that dared not speak its name now has a name, but it's spoken through clenched teeth. You pause in one of those lecture halls, oak benches, chalk squeaking on slate, and listen to the arguments. A young student hesitates before asking, "But sir, what if they are happy?" The professor frowns, adjusts his spectacles, and writes aberration on the board. There's no room for happiness in his equation. Yet outside in the streets of Berlin and Paris, life keeps contradicting theory. Men still meet under lamplight. Women still write letters sealed with perfume. The body refuses to obey the textbook. And sometimes the textbook itself rebels. A few brave scientists quietly begin to agree that homosexuality might be innate, not chosen, not sinful. A variation, not a vice, Hirschfeld insists. The phrase becomes a small flame in the darkness. You look around and realize something subtle but profound. By turning love into data, society accidentally preserves it. Every report, every diagram, every case study meant to pathologize has become evidence that these lives existed, that they were not aberrations, but people. When history lost the letters, science kept the files. And from those files, one day, understanding will be rebuilt. So you step out of the laboratory into the cold evening air. The moon looks indifferent, as it always does. But beneath its light, people still reach for one another, still invent names for feelings too big for any theory. The scientists may measure, dissect, define, but they can never cure what was never a disease. You step into a salon, heavy velvet curtains, cigar smoke curling like thought laughter, rippling through the air like champagne bubbles. The century is nearing its end, and yet something astonishing begins to bloom. Against the backdrop of repression, art becomes rebellion. And rebellion, in turn, becomes beauty. Painters, poets, and composers, those eternal misfits, start turning what society calls shame into something radiant. They do not write manifestos, they write sonatas. They do not shout protests, they paint bodies in impossible light. In this new aesthetic rebellion, queerness hides in plain sight, not as confession, but as creation. Oscar Wilde is here, of course. How could he not be? His laughter fills the room before you even see him. He wears a green carnation on his lapel, his private signal, his joke with friends. A symbol of artifice, he says, smiling, because nature is rarely right. His plays are filled with secret codes, witty banter that tiptoes around forbidden truths. Society adores him until it doesn't. His trial in 1895, you recall, wasn't just about his private life. It was a public crucifixion of every man who ever dared to be beautiful. When the prosecutor demanded he define the love that dare not speak its name, Wilde replied, "It is that deep spiritual affection that is as pure as it is perfect." You could hear the air leave the courtroom. For a moment, art and honesty shared the same breath. Around him, other artists mirror that courage. In Vienna, Gustav Klimt paints shimmering bodies golden and androgynous, swirling together in a sensual blur. In France, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec sketches cabaret performers of every gender, and none treating their glamour not as spectacle, but as truth. And in Russia, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky writes symphonies that sound like yearning itself. He writes letters too carefully, nervously, to his confidants about the impossibility of his love for men. You can almost feel him pouring all that repression into his music. Listen to his Pathétique symphony, and you can hear it, the ache of beauty born under pressure. This era, for all its cruelty, accidentally gives birth to modern identity. The more society insists on silence, the louder art begins to hum. You stroll through galleries and opera halls, where queer desire hides in brushstrokes and overtures encoded for those who know how to look. Wilde once said, "Man is least himself when he talks in his own person. Give him a mask, and he will tell you the truth." It seems everyone takes his advice. The salons of Paris, Berlin, and Vienna become both stage and sanctuary. You find Colette, the French writer and performer, dancing on tables, kissing her female lover on stage, sending critics into moral spasms. "I love what I love," she says simply. You wish history had more of that kind of honesty. Nearby, Aubrey Beardsley sketches Wilde's plays with bold, erotic curves that scandalize the British public. They called it decadence. He called it art. Even the photographers of the age, experimenting with new technology, capture intimacy in ways the world hasn't yet found words for. Wilhelm von Gloden in Italy takes portraits of young men draped in classical robes, their gazes calm, unapologetic. He claims it's about Greek aesthetics, but tenderness in his images says otherwise. The authorities look the other way. Art, after all, provides plausible deniability. You notice something almost miraculous, the shift from hiding to hinting. Queer artists no longer bury themselves entirely. They leave clues. A gesture in a self-portrait, a dedication line in a book, a whispered joke in a letter. Every clue becomes a lifeline to the future. You standing here now can read them like breadcrumbs through time. Of course not. Everyone gets away unscathed. Some lose careers, others their freedom, still others their sanity. Wilde dies in exile, muttering, "Either that wallpaper goes, or I do." Tchaikovsky's death remains shrouded in mystery. Some say cholera, others a coerced suicide to avoid scandal. It's tempting to see only tragedy. But to do that would be to miss the defiance that runs like a secret melody beneath their endings. You think about how in every generation, artists take what is forbidden and make it unforgettable. They can't change the law, so they change the imagination. They transform disgust into curiosity, fear into fascination, silence into applause. When society finally begins to understand queerness in the 20th century, it will be because these artists planted the seeds in its subconscious. You pause before a painting, a simple portrait of two men sitting close, one resting a hand on the other's knee. No title, no names. But the tenderness is unmistakable. Somewhere a critic will write that it suggests friendship. You almost laugh. Yes, friendship. That most convenient word. Outside the city glows with new electricity, literally and metaphorically. The world is learning to light itself artificially, and maybe that's the perfect metaphor for this moment. Artificial light reveals what natural daylight hides. It's garish, yes, but it's honest. You step back into the night, your footsteps echoing over cobblestones that have carried revolutionaries and lovers alike. Behind you, laughter spills from a cabaret door. Inside, someone sings a torch song in a smoky voice, a melody about a love that the world still refuses to name, but one that everyone deep down understands. You've wandered through whispers and lamplight, through letters, prisons, and ballrooms. But now, as the 1800s flicker toward their end, something changes in the air. The silence starts to crack. What was hidden begins to hum faintly but firmly, like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards of history. The century closes with a strange contradiction, repression at its peak, and yet awareness rising like dawn. People who once thought they were alone now begin to recognize each other in coded words, in art, in courage. The unnatural starts to realize it is simply human. You can feel it, this quiet awakening. The scandals of Oscar Wilde's trial still echo through Europe. But in their shadow, others pick up the pen, the brush, the banner. The shame that once kept everyone silent has cracked open a conversation. In Berlin, Magnus Hirschfeld's Scientific Humanitarian Committee, founded in 1897, begins collecting petitions to repeal anti-gay laws. It's the first organized movement for homosexual rights in recorded history. Their motto, justice through science. A bit stiff, perhaps, but it's a beginning. You can almost see the meetings rooms full of thinkers and dreamers talking softly so the neighbors won't hear. They know they might not see freedom in their lifetimes, but perhaps someday someone will. Hirschfeld writes, "Love is as varied as the people who feel it." A simple sentence, but it sounds like a prophecy. Elsewhere in England, the shock waves from Wilde's trial ripple into new conversations about morality and hypocrisy. Journalists begin to question whether laws against indecency belong in a modern society. They write cautiously, using euphemisms like the problem of the intermediate sex. But the fact that they write at all is revolutionary. Public debate has replaced silent persecution with words, and words, as history has shown, have a way of outliving everything. You return to Paris once more. The Belle Époque glitters on, but the laughter feels more knowing now. Artists keep playing with boundaries. Sculptors mold androgynous forms. Writers pen ambiguous loves, musicians weave melodies that sound like confessions. The underground is no longer a single hidden room. It's a network stretching from city to city, bound together by courage and curiosity. Across the ocean, America prepares to enter a new century, its cities swelling its voices, multiplying. The Boston marriages continue quietly, their residents growing old together in mutual devotion. Walt Whitman dies in 1892, but his legacy lingers like incense perfuming a future that will rediscover him as a prophet of queer humanity. And beyond all these visible figures, countless invisible ones, servants, soldiers, sailors, nuns, laborers, carry their truths quietly through the decades. The history books won't name them, but they are the scaffolding on which freedom will one day stand. You stop for a moment and think about the pattern of it all. 1,000 hidden threads running through a century of steel and empire, slowly weaving into something strong enough to resist erasure. It's almost poetic a society obsessed with control gives birth to identities it cannot contain. Science once used to condemn now begins to defend. Writers start asking whether inversion might be innate rather than immoral. Artists continue to paint, compose, and write their way toward honesty. And in the quiet corners of cities and colonies, small communities of trust form circles of people who begin to say, "We are not alone." The 19th century doesn't end with revolution. It ends with a murmur, a whisper in many languages. English, German, French, Hindi, Swahili, Hawaiian, all saying the same thing: we exist. The old world doesn't collapse. It simply becomes porous. Its walls begin to leak light. You imagine standing on the threshold of 1900, watching the gas lamps flicker out as electric bulbs blink awake. It's more than a technological shift. It's symbolic. The world is changing how it sees. Illumination itself is evolving. For centuries, queer lives had to hide in the soft glow of secrecy. Now, even if faintly, there's a harsher, brighter light coming. Exposure can be terrifying, but it also means visibility. History rarely grants happy endings, but it offers continuity. The courage of the 1800s, the poets who wrote in code, the lovers who risked it all, the scientists who defied ridicule, becomes the soil from which 20th century movements will grow. Without their whispers, there would be no marches. Without their secrets, no speeches. You look back over the century you've just walked through, from Byron's rebellious laughter to Anne Lister's coded diaries, from Wilde's courtroom defiance to Hirschfeld's scientific petitions. Each moment, small as it seemed, carved a path forward. They didn't know it, but they were writing the prologue to modern identity. And maybe that's the gentlest truth this story offers. Progress doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sighs. Sometimes it hides behind curtains, or dances in disguise, or writes letters in invisible ink, but it moves always forward. You close your eyes and listen the faint echo of carriage wheels, the murmur of salons, the scratching of pens, the heartbeat of those who dared to love. The century is over, but their courage remains lingering in every shadow waiting to be seen. And now you know the untold history, not of shame, but of persistence. Not of sin, but of survival. Because even in the darkest century, love refused to whisper forever. As the century's final gas lamps fade, the world shifts again, this time, not in secret, but in smoke. The hum of hidden love gives way to the roar of engines, and the quiet salons of art are drowned by factories. Steel's soot and sweat rewrite progress itself, birthing a new story, the dark side of the Industrial Revolution. The first thing you notice isn't the sound, it's the smell. Thick, oily smoke snakes through the morning air, and you realize the sunrise no longer glows gold, but burns dull gray, as if the sky itself forgot how to wake up. Welcome to the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, where nature clocked out and the machines clocked in. You cough once, twice, and wonder if the air tastes like burnt toast every morning. How did anyone ever think this was progress? You trudge along cobblestones slick with soot. The ground crunches beneath your boots, not gravel, but coal dust, ground fine as powder. Every doorway exhales steam. The world feels alive, but not in a comforting birds and butterflies way. It's alive the way a sleeping beast breathes slow, heavy, and hungry. Factories stretch down the horizon, their chimneys spewing clouds like volcanic spires. You can't tell where the earth ends and the smoke begins. Inside one of those red brick giants, iron gears spin with mechanical rhythm, chka-chka-chka, the heartbeat of a new age. You pause, mesmerized by the motion. It's hypnotic, almost beautiful. Then the door opens, and a wave of heat slaps your face. Rows of men, women, and children hunch over spindles, each movement a blur. They don't speak. The machines are too loud for words. It's as if the world decided conversation was overrated and replaced it with grinding metal. You wonder if anyone ever imagined this future while sitting by candlelight 50 years earlier. Did they picture progress looking like a furnace? Did they imagine a world where people traded starlight for smoke and rivers for canals that ran black? Because here even the water looks exhausted, thick with dye and runoff swirling with colors that should belong to sunsets, not sewers. A foreman struts past, tapping a cane against his palm. He doesn't shout. He doesn't need to. The workers already move faster when they sense him. You spot a boy, maybe 12, lugging a basket of cotton so heavy it nearly topples him. He grins when he catches you watching, as if embarrassed to be seen struggling. You almost want to tell him it's okay to rest, but you know he won't. Rest isn't part of the schedule. There's a strange rhythm to it all. Order, efficiency, control. The city hums like one vast machine, every person a moving part. It's mesmerizing and terrifying at once, like standing inside a clock tower and hearing the gears grind inches from your ear. The irony hits you. Time feels faster here, yet somehow nobody seems to move forward. Out in the streets, merchants shout, carriages rattle, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolls. You glance at the steeple, its stone turned black by years of smoke, and think how strange it must be to pray for clean air. The bell's tone feels softer now, muffled by the industrial growl. Maybe even heaven has to shout a little louder to be heard. You remember hearing that cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow were once small towns wrapped in green. Now they're a sea of chimneys, their rivers running chemical blues and metallic greens. People call it progress, but you can't help noticing that progress smells a lot like burnt iron and wet wool. A man in a waistcoat bumps into you, muttering about modern miracles. He's carrying a brochure about the latest steam engine, sleeker, faster, stronger. You peek at the sketch, a massive iron beast pulling carriages across the countryside. He grins, saying, "Soon we'll outpace the wind itself." You smile politely, though part of you wonders if humans can move faster than wind can. They also outrun their own consequences. There's something darkly funny about it all. A world obsessed with improvement, yet blind to what it's breaking. You imagine someone 100 years from now standing in your spot squinting through history books asking, "Didn't they notice the sky turning black?" You'd like to answer, "Oh, they noticed. They just had deadlines." You walk past a pub where exhausted men nurse pints of ale before another shift. Their faces are mapped with soot, their eyes glazed with the kind of fatigue no nap can fix. One of them raises his mug toward you and says, "To progress." You lift an imaginary glass, because really, what else can you do? As you continue, a horse-drawn wagon rattles by, carrying barrels of something that smells faintly metallic. The driver hums a tune lost under the wheels. Behind him, a line of chimney sweeps march like tiny soldiers, brushes slung over their shoulders like rifles. You think of how they crawl into chimneys, narrower than coffins, armed with nothing but rags and courage. And you wonder if the price of progress is this much ash. Who gets to call it advancement? Above the rooftops, the sun tries to break through the haze. It doesn't make it far. You squint at the pale circle and realize the new century isn't arriving with light, but with smoke. Progress, it seems, has a strange sense of humor. It gives you steam engines and takes away sunsets. You stop for a moment, letting the heat, the smell, the noise sink in. The world around you is loud, alive, and endlessly busy. It's the beginning of something colossal, a new age. You can almost hear the century creaking open like a heavy iron door, and deep inside something whispers, "This is only the beginning." You quickly learn that the machines don't serve humans, they consume them. The factory you stand in feels less like a workplace and more like the belly of a great beast, its hunger measured in shifts and steam. Every gear's turn sounds like a growl. Every hiss of the boiler is a sigh of appetite. You might think invention is noble, a product of human genius. But here invention feels more like a monster that learned to eat without chewing. Take the textile mills, for instance. The spinning jenny, that miracle of progress, sits humming in the center of the room, surrounded by a dozen smaller looms, like worshippers at an altar. Its whirring spindles twist cotton into thread faster than any human could dream of doing by hand. But to feed it, you need hands, small ones. You notice them darting between the gears, quick as mice belonging to children who should be skipping stones or arguing about who gets the last crust of pie. Their fingers disappear into the machinery, and every now and then someone gasps. The sound cuts through the factory noise for just a moment before being swallowed again by the rhythm of production. If you think that's exaggeration, look at the records from the time. A 10-hour day was considered merciful. 14 was the norm. There's a sort of cruel poetry in how the era defined efficiency, more output, less humanity. And you can't help but smile grimly at how familiar that sounds. Ever been told to work smarter, not harder? Well, the Industrial Revolution invented that slogan's darker cousin, work harder, and we'll call it progress. You step closer to the looms, and your sleeve brushes against the threads, warm, oily, alive with motion. The forewoman, a wiry woman with a voice like a whistle, snaps. "Keep clear of the rollers, love. They've got no manners." You laugh softly, though her face isn't joking. She's seen what happens when a sleeve or braid gets caught. The machine doesn't stop, it only stutters just long enough for someone to scream. Somewhere above you, shafts of light sneak through grimy windows. Dust hangs in the air like fog, glittering faintly, deceptively pretty. If you didn't know better, you might think the whole room was filled with tiny stars. But they're not stars. They're fibers. They cling to skin, to lungs, to life itself, and over time, they choke everything they touch. Mill fever, the workers call it. You wonder how many of them ever realize that progress can kill quietly, without a single heroic headline. In the corner, a man oils the gears with the patience of a priest performing a ritual. He hums a hymn as he works something about mercy. You almost laugh at the irony, Mercy's, in a place where even the walls sweat heat. You think of the inventors, James Watt with his steam engine, Richard Arkwright with his frame names celebrated in textbooks as pioneers. But looking at this room, you can't help asking, did they ever imagine this? You take another step back and nearly trip over a crate filled with raw cotton. Its label reads, Imported American South. You pause. So this is where empire meets industry. The cotton grown by enslaved hands across the ocean spun into wealth here and sold back to the world as the miracle of modern civilization. The machine's appetite, it seems, doesn't stop at borders. You glance toward a girl working a carding machine. She looks about 10, her hair tied with a scrap of cloth, her arms marked by tiny scars. She catches your eye and grins, a strange bright grin amid all the gray. It's not so bad, she says, shrugging. You get used to the noise. You want to ask her what she dreams about, but something tells you she doesn't have the luxury. Sometimes you think about how invention once promised freedom. The printing press freed ideas. The compass freed travelers. The steam engine, it freed no one. It bound people to schedules, to timetables, to whistle blows that divided their lives into shifts. Imagine living by a bell that doesn't tell time, it commands it. You can almost hear the whistle in your ears, sharp and cold, cutting through thought itself. There's an odd sort of pride among the workers, though. We make the world move. One man shouts over the din, his grin streaked with grime. And he's right. They do. These factories are birthing the modern age, one thread, one piston at a time. But as you look at his trembling hands, you realize the modern age has teeth. If you close your eyes, the sound of the machines almost becomes a symphony, chaotic, relentless, oddly rhythmic. It's easy to imagine why people back then saw beauty in it. The problem is, beauty can be blinding. For every man who marvels at a steam engine's elegance, there's a child somewhere coughing up soot. Maybe that's the cruel genius of the Industrial Revolution. It made suffering look efficient. You're told it's for progress, for growth, for civilization's sake. And so you keep walking through the smoke, watching the machines spin and hiss. And you wonder if the world ever learns to feed its inventions without feeding on people too. You follow the small footsteps, this time the ones half the size of your own, leading down a narrow corridor between clattering machines. The air is thick with lint. It tastes dry metallic like the inside of a coin purse. The floor trembles under the rhythm of looms above, and your ears buzz from the constant clack, clack, clack. You can't help but duck, though you're nowhere near the spinning belts. That's what noise like this does. It makes you flinch, even when there's no danger close. A small figure crawls out from beneath a loom. You blink. It's a child face smeared with soot, hair the color of the dust clouding the air. He carries a brush and a rag tied to a stick. He grins shyly before vanishing back under the machine, wriggling like a mouse between gears. The foreman nearby doesn't even glance at him. You realize this isn't sneaking, it's his job. They call them scavengers and piecers. The words sound almost quaint, as if they describe a nursery chore. But scavengers crawl under the spinning frames while they're still running, collecting bits of cotton so nothing goes to waste. One wrong move, one slip, and the machine takes more than cotton. The piecers, usually girls, reach between threads to fix breaks mid-spin. Their fingers need to be small and quick. If you were to ask why children, the factory owners would say, they fit better. You'd like to believe that's sarcasm, but it isn't. You walk deeper into the mill, and the air turns hot and sweet, full of damp fibers. A boy coughs a raw, sharp sound, and a few others join him like a grim chorus. You think of lungs coated in dust of children too tired to play after work. The Industrial Revolution didn't just steal their health, it stole their childhood and called it employment. Some of these children are orphans, apprenticed by workhouses under the guise of charity. You've probably heard of those grim stone buildings, where the poor were promised food and shelter in exchange for labor. What they got instead was a trade innocence for survival. There's a dark irony there, isn't there? The same empire that preached Christian virtue ran its machines on the bones of its children. You think of the reports that started surfacing men like Robert Blinko, who described crawling through machinery as if the devil himself turned the wheels. Or the reformers horrified at what they found, pushing for laws like the Factory Acts. The first in 1833 said no child under 9 could work. Admirable on paper, but who checked inspectors were rare and lies were cheap. Many factories simply told the children to say they were older. Progress runs best when nobody asks questions. You step out for air, but even outside the soot follows. It coats your eyelashes. The streets teem with small workers on their way home. Eyes dull, hands cracked. They look like old souls trapped in small bodies. You catch one boy whistling and ask half joking, "Still got energy after all that?" He shrugs. If you stop, they say you're lazy. Then he flashes a toothy grin that's missing 2 teeth. You try to smile back, but the joke falls flat somewhere in your throat. The funny thing, well, darkly funny, is how normal it all became. Factory owners argued that working taught discipline, that it kept children away from mischief. You can almost hear the speeches, "It's character building." Imagine saying that while standing over a 12-year-old fainting from heat. It's the kind of logic that would make even satire nervous. A little girl passes carrying a bucket half her size. Her hands are red, swollen, blistered. She could be your sister, your daughter, your younger self from some other life. You watch her disappear into the fog of steam, and it hits you. These children aren't background details in a sad painting. They are the machinery. Without them, the Industrial Revolution would grind to a halt. The grown-ups designed the machines, but the children kept them alive. If you lived in that time, you might convince yourself it was temporary, just until the family gets by. But the truth is, once the machine starts feeding it, it never stops. Every invention meant to make life easier somehow made someone else's harder. You wonder if any of these kids ever dreamed of escaping of fields without smoke or rivers clear enough to see their reflection. Maybe they did. But dreams need air, and here even breathing feels like rebellion. You lean against a factory wall, watching them pass. Some laugh softly together. Others walk silent, heads bowed. The sky above is a dull, bruised color, the kind you see before rain. A flock of pigeons circles overhead, the only creatures still free to fly. You can't help but think how strange it is in an age obsessed with building the future. The smallest hands were the ones holding it up. And as the shift bell rings again, echoing through the alleys, you realize childhood didn't disappear. It was repurposed, industrialized, packaged neatly inside the gears of progress. The world didn't just invent the modern machine, it invented the modern childhood cut short. You think progress is beautiful? Try standing next to it when it screams. The whistle blows sharp as a blade and you flinch. The morning shift begins again. Steam coughs from every vent and the ground trembles with the pulse of engines. The factories are awake, hungry, impatient. This is where the Industrial Revolution sheds its polite mask and shows you its teeth. You're no longer watching invention. You're inside it, and it's alive. The heat inside the ironworks hits you like a wall. Sparks burst from molten metal in flashes of orange and white. The men here don't talk much, they can't. The roar of the furnaces drowns everything. You can feel the heat licking your skin, even from a distance. It's the kind of warmth that burns through fabric, through thought, through fear itself. The air tastes of rust and sweat and something faintly electric. A worker passes, his face streaked with ash, arms gleaming with sweat. He carries a long rod of iron toward the forge, his eyes focused on the glow ahead. He looks like a priest carrying a sacred offering. Only here the altar is fire, and the god demands flesh. You think of the word progress again and realize how easily it could be mistaken for sacrifice. Accidents are constant companions here. A man slips on an oil patch. His glove catches in a belt. Another's sleeve brushes a gear. There are no villains to blame, just the machine doing what it was built to do. Move forward no matter who's in the way. You remember reading that by the mid-1800s, thousands lost limbs or lives in these very halls. The newspapers called them industrial casualties, as if the word industrial could somehow sterilize the tragedy. You glance at the massive flywheel turning with perfect rhythm, and it's hard not to admire it. There's something hypnotic about power made visible metal, obeying motion, motion, obeying steam, and steam obeying human ambition. But if you stare long enough, you notice the cracks in that logic. Power doesn't flow one way. It feeds back. The workers feed the engine, but the engine also devours them, one spark, one shift, one decade at a time. In the corner, a mechanic with soot-blackened hands wipes his brow. "Beautiful, ain't it?" he shouts over the roar, nodding toward the machinery. You shout back, "Terrifying." He laughs, a sound like gravel, and replies, "Same thing most days." He turns back to his work, tightening bolts, with the patience of someone who knows the machine's temper. There's affection in his movements, like tending to a wild animal. You wonder if he realizes that it's already tamed him instead. The most dangerous part, you learn, isn't fire, it's routine. The moment when muscle memory replaces fear, when the mind drifts. That's when hands slip, belts catch, lives end. The company ledgers don't list names, only numbers. Injury count, downtime, replacement cost. The human part is the least efficient variable in the system, and the system doesn't like inefficiency. Outside, you watch a row of steam engines being tested, massive beasts exhaling white clouds into the morning air. The engineers beam with pride. You can't deny it's impressive. For the first time in history, humans have mastered power without wind, water, or muscle. They've built thunder in a box, but you can't help wondering what it means when a species finally learns how to mimic lightning. Does it remember how to stop? The railways stretch across the countryside, cutting through green fields and quiet villages like veins of iron. People call them miracles. You think of them more as scars, beautiful, yes, but reminders of what was carved away. The engines thunder by spewing smoke over cottages whose thatched roofs once smelled of wildflowers. The future is coming, whether anyone invited it or not. A curious detail, many workers believed their machines had moods. They spoke to them, pleaded with them, even apologized when they broke. Superstition, maybe. Or maybe it was survival instinct, an ancient reflex to appease the thing that holds your life in its gears. You catch yourself whispering, "Once easy now," as a piston jerks too close to your face and realize you're doing the same thing. Ever noticed how the language of progress sounds suspiciously religious? Factories called temples of industry, inventors praised as visionaries, workers told to show devotion to their trade. You half expect someone to hand you a hymnal titled "Steam and Salvation." And maybe that's the secret. The Industrial Revolution didn't just build machines, it built a new faith. One where the gods run on coal and miracles cost overtime. As dusk settles, you step outside the foundry. The glow from the windows paints the street in orange halos like 100 small suns trapped behind glass. You can still feel the heat radiating from your clothes. The world hums with energy, raw, reckless, unstoppable. For a brief, dizzy moment, you understand why people worshipped it. The machine promises power, order, and progress. But as you watch the smoke curl upward, blotting out the stars, you can't shake the feeling that it also demands a soul in return. You step out of the ironworks and into the city. But there's no fresh air waiting for you. Only more smoke wearing a different perfume. The streets are alive. If alive still means breathing through soot, you try to take a deep breath and end up coughing instead. The cobblestones glisten with oily puddles, and somewhere a cartwheel splashes through one with a slurp that sounds almost obscene. Welcome to the industrial city, where the skyline is a forest of chimneys and the horizon smells faintly of despair. Everywhere you look, the buildings lean too close to each other, like gossiping neighbors. Laundry lines crisscross above your head, their gray sheets fluttering like surrender flags. The alleys are so narrow you can stretch out your arms and touch both sides at once. People live stacked on top of each other here, families of 10 or 12 crammed into rooms smaller than your kitchen. You try not to imagine the smell when rain soaks through the roof and mixes with smoke, sweat, and sewage. Too late you imagine it anyway. A woman passes you carrying a baby on her hip, her other hand clutching a bucket. She nods politely before disappearing down a stairwell that smells of mildew and boiled cabbage. You follow curious. The room below is dim lit only by the faint orange glow of a single candle. 3 other children sleep on straw sacks. One coughs a sound too deep for such a small chest. You realize the baby's not the only one struggling to breathe. The mother hums softly, her voice cracked but steady. She doesn't need to tell you this is home. Disease moves quickly in places like this. Cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, they thrive where air doesn't move and water lies still. The same progress that made soap cheaper made clean water harder to find. The pipes that carry waste run under the same streets as the ones carrying drinking water, and you can guess how well that ends. In 1854, a man named John Snow, not that one, traced a cholera outbreak in London to a single contaminated pump handle. One handle, hundreds dead. It's the kind of fact that makes you want to boil every drink you've ever had. Outside, you hear laughter. Children, barefoot faces streaked black, chase a hoop made from an old barrel rim. For a moment, you almost forget the smoke. Joy, it seems, is stubborn. But then, a factory whistle blares, and the sound scatters them like pigeons. Playtime's over. You wander toward the river. It's supposed to be a river, at least. The surface glistens with rainbow films of oil bubbles rising like lazy ghosts. The stench hits you before the view does sour chemical unmistakable. You'd call it tragic if it weren't so perversely impressive. The water itself seems to have joined the industrial workforce. It's a lie, you could joke, but the punchline's cruel. It is alive with bacteria. A man in a flat cap leans on the railing beside you. Used to fish here, he says, not looking up. Now I can't even find the fish-only boots. He chuckles dryly, then spits into the water. The spit vanishes instantly into the black current, as if swallowed by the city itself. You nod, unsure what else to say. Sometimes history doesn't need narration, it just needs silence. You walk through the streets at dusk, and the lamps flicker to life, gas-fed, hissing softly. They give off a warm, steady glow, almost romantic if you squint hard enough. Couples stroll arm in arm, their boots crunching on ash. Somewhere a violin plays from an upstairs window. And you realize people adapt. They always do. Even when the world smells like smoke and the stars have been replaced by factory lights, someone still finds a tune worth humming. Still, there's a strange melancholy in the air. The city feels like it's holding its breath. The factories never sleep, and neither do the people who depend on them. You pass a baker's shop, the window fogged from heat. Inside, a boy kneads dough with mechanical precision, his eyes barely open. He might be 14, but his posture says 40. Across the street, a preacher stands on a crate shouting about salvation. Repent from greed, he cries, though his voice is nearly drowned by the rumble of carts and footsteps. Nobody stops to listen. Not because they disagree, but because they're late. In a city like this, even morality has a schedule. You pause beneath a street lamp and notice how the light doesn't reach the ground evenly. The glow fades halfway, swallowed by the smoke above. It feels poetic somehow. Humanity invents light bright enough to banish darkness, only to choke it with its own creation. You can't decide if that's tragic or just funny in a cosmic way. There's an expression floating around in this age: where there's muck, there's brass. It means that filth breeds fortune. The rich build mansions uphill, away from the stench, while the poor build their lungs in the shadows below. You wonder if anyone sees the irony that the same air fuels both their fortunes. Night deepens. Somewhere a baby cries. A clock tower tolls 8 times, each note heavy with soot. You lean on a railing, staring out over rooftops that blur into haze. The city stretches endlessly, a labyrinth of chimneys and dreams. And you can't help thinking civilization didn't rise out of marble, and genius, it crawled out of smog, coughing. You begin to understand that progress has an odd sense of morality. It doesn't care who gets stepped on, so long as the gears keep turning. Somewhere between the smoke and the steam, profit became a kind of religion. Numbers replacing prayers, ledgers replacing scripture. And the factory owners, they became its high priests, their sermons delivered not in cathedrals, but in boardrooms filled with cigar smoke and ambition. You picture one of them now, a man in a waistcoat fine enough to buy an entire workers' street. He sips brandy while reading reports of increased productivity. That means the night shift didn't faint as often this week. Splendid, he says, jotting notes with a gold pen that costs more than a family's yearly wage. He isn't cruel exactly, just comfortable. Comfort makes compassion inconvenient. The workers' names blur together in those ledgers: John, Mary, William, hundreds of them reduced to columns of cost and output. The more they produce, the less they seem to matter. The logic is brutal, but tidy: profit up, humanity down. You can't help noticing how that formula hasn't exactly gone out of fashion. If you've ever stared at a spreadsheet too long, watching people turn into numbers, congratulations, you've glimpsed the Industrial Revolution's true legacy. In some corners of the city, the contrast between rich and poor grows so sharp it could cut glass. You pass a mansion glowing with chandeliers, its ballroom echoing with laughter. Inside, women in silk gowns waltz to a piano's gentle rhythm. Just beyond the gate, a factory girl trudges past, carrying coal dust in her hair instead of pearls. Same city, different planets. You wonder if the people inside ever look out the window, or if the smoke outside is too thick to bother. You hear rumors of the captains of industry, men like Richard Arkwright, Andrew Carnegie, and later Rockefeller, names that still echo in history books. They built empires from steam and steel, reshaping the world with every investment. And yet, for every captain steering the ship, 1,000 unseen sailors sank beneath it. It's easy to celebrate genius when you don't have to hear the coughing. There's something almost theatrical about how the era justified itself. Pamphlets preached the moral value of hard work, sermons praised labor as divine duty. If you're poor, it's because you didn't work hard enough. If you're rich, it's because God smiled on your effort. Convenient theology, isn't it? Especially when your factory runs on 12-year-olds. One pamphlet you find claims industry is the lifeblood of the nation. You smile grimly because standing here, the metaphor isn't lost on you. The blood is literal. You can see it in bandaged hands, crushed fingers, burned arms. Yet people still believe the lie because hope like coal burns even when it hurts to hold. And not all factory owners were villains. Some genuinely tried to make things better. Robert Owen, for example, created model villages for his workers at New Lanark, shortening work hours and building schools for their children. Admirable, yes, but even Owen's reforms became controversial. Critics accused him of spoiling the workers, as though comfort might make them lazy. You chuckle softly. History really does love to punish kindness for being inefficient. Walking past the warehouses, you hear a foreman shouting, "Time is money." The phrase sounds familiar, too familiar. It started around this era, after all. You wonder what Benjamin Franklin would have thought seeing his proverb turned into a whip. The irony is sharp. A society obsessed with saving time has no idea what to do with it once saved. The more you look around, the more you realize how thoroughly the system swallowed everyone: workers, owners, even inventors. It's like a massive play where each person has a role and no one dares improvise. The machine must keep running, the ledger must stay balanced, and the sky must keep darkening to prove it's all working. At a nearby cafe, you overhear two men debating politics, laissez-faire. One shouts, slamming his fist. The market regulates itself. You sip your imaginary tea and think, sure it does. Like a wolf regulates the size of its dinner. The government mostly agrees with him, preferring not to interfere. After all, industry means growth, and growth means pride, and pride means empire. A church bell rings in the distance, muffled by smog. It's Sunday, supposedly a day of rest, though the factories hum just as loudly. You notice the workers hurrying by their faces, lined not with sin, but with exhaustion. Rest is a privilege, not a commandment, when the rent's due Monday. And yet amid the hypocrisy, there's a strange brilliance to it all. This faith in progress, this worship of the machine built the modern world you live in. Every train you board, every bulb that lights your room, every phone that buzzes in your pocket. They all descend from this same altar of soot. You can't entirely condemn it without also condemning yourself. That's the real trick history plays. It makes you complicit. You keep walking through the smoke, past the counting houses, past the posters that read, "Work hard, rise higher." The ink has started to run from the damp air, the slogan bleeding like a wound. You pause, tracing a finger along the faded letters. Progress, you realize, isn't clean. It never was. It's an empire built not on marble, but on grime, and every empire needs its worshippers. You'd think the Industrial Revolution was a man's story. Iron barons, inventors, tycoons. But listen closely, and you'll hear the sound of women everywhere sewing, scrubbing, hauling, coughing, surviving. They aren't on the posters or in the speeches, but they're there in every spinning mill, every cramped laundry, every kitchen lit by gaslight instead of sunlight. The clang of the looms has a rhythm now, almost musical. You watch rows of women bend and twist in practiced harmony, their fingers darting between threads with precision that could shame any clockmaker. Their hair is tied tight, sleeves rolled up, faces streaked with oil. They look like soldiers on a front line no one remembers to honor. For many, the factory wasn't just work, it was escape. Out there in the countryside, a woman's life was measured in laundry loads and childbirths. Here, at least, she could earn her own wage, however meager. You can almost hear the arguments that must have rippled through kitchens at night. A woman's place is in the home, the men say. But the home doesn't pay rent, does it? Still, the freedom came with a cruel twist. Employers loved hiring women. They could pay them half the men's wage for the same 12-hour shift. Equality arrived early, but only in exhaustion. You glance at one woman, thin, wiry eyes, sharp as needles. She notices you watching and smirks. "You think this is hard?" she shouts over the machine's roar. "Try mending 4 shirts after this and then waking before dawn." You grin despite yourself. There's pride there, raw and unbreakable. She might not own the mill, but she owns her endurance. When the shift ends, the factory doors open like the gates of a furnace. Women spill out into the cool dusk skirts, clinging with sweat, their laughter rising like smoke. Some hurry home to feed families. Others crowd into tenement kitchens where they share stories, bread, and sometimes songs. One hums a tune about a mill girl who dreamed of marrying a clerk, but chose her freedom instead. The others join in softly at first, then louder. The melody is sweet defiant. Not every woman worked in factories, of course. Many became servants, maids, cooks, nannies, for the very families whose wealth grew from industrial smoke. You picture one now scrubbing floors in a grand London townhouse, her knuckles raw, her mind wandering to the children she left behind in the countryside. Upstairs, her employer writes a letter about the plight of the working classes, unaware that the plight is currently polishing her silver. Then there were the match girls, young women who dipped sticks into white phosphorus to make matches. Their fingers glowed faintly in the dark, a ghostly light that looked almost magical until the pain began. Phossy jaw, they called it, a disease that ate through bone. Their faces disfigured their lives, shortened all for a penny a box. In 1888, they finally went on strike, led by a girl named Sarah Chapman. You can almost see her standing on a crate shouting through the factory gates, "We're not disposable." The crowd of women cheering her on isn't just a strike, it's history catching its breath. Even in the most brutal corners, women found ways to resist. They formed reading circles, learned to write letters, organized quietly when men wouldn't listen. Imagine the courage it took to defy a boss who thought of you as replaceable, as a broken loom. Yet they did it over and over, their defiance tucked neatly between shifts and supper. You pass a row of washerwomen bent over a trough. Their laughter echoes down the alley, like defiance disguised as routine. One of them catches your eye. "Go on then," she says. "Tell me what you do without us." You open your mouth, but no answer comes. Because she's right. You wouldn't have a clean shirt, a mended sleeve, a civilized dinner. The backbone of progress isn't iron. It's calloused hands. Sometimes late at night, you imagine one of these women lying awake in her small rented room, hands still trembling from the loom's rhythm. Maybe she looks out the window watching the factory smoke drift across the moon. Maybe she dreams not of luxury, but of quiet. A world where the only hum she hears is the wind, not the spinning frame. History rarely gave her a name, but she's there in every census, every birth record, every faded photograph, where a woman stands stiffly beside a brick wall, apron-tied gaze, unflinching. The Industrial Revolution may have been built by men's machines, but it ran on women's endurance. And when you hear the stories of those women who rose higher, Florence Nightingale reforming hospitals, Elizabeth Gaskell writing about mill girls with ink-stained compassion, or Mary Wollstonecraft daring to argue that women might just be human, you realize something quietly radical amid the smoke and steel. The idea of equality itself was forged. The first time you hear it, it's not a roar, it's a murmur. A voice in a pub corner, a whisper at the back of a mill, a phrase repeated like a prayer. It doesn't have to be this way. You almost miss it under the noise of progress, But it's there, the first tremor of rebellion stirring beneath the soot. Soon the whispers multiply. Pamphlets pass hand to hand, folded into coat pockets, smuggled through factory gates. They talk of fairness, of dignity, of pay that doesn't vanish before payday. Some are written by men with ink on their fingers, others by women with calluses on theirs. You imagine reading one by candlelight, your hands shaking not from fear but from recognition. For the first time, the word worker starts to mean something larger than exhausted. You wander through a tavern thick with smoke and sweat. A man with soot still in his eyebrows stands on a stool reading from a crumpled leaflet. Brothers and sisters, he begins, we are not machines. The crowd cheers nervous at first, then wild. Tankards slam the tables. Somewhere, someone laughs and shouts, "Tell that to the foreman!" The laughter is bitter, but it's also the sound of awakening. It's hard to imagine how radical those words once were. Today, demanding a weekend sounds ordinary. Back then, it was treason against the economy. The Chartists, the Luddites, the trade unionists, they weren't just angry, they were dangerous. You picture a group of them gathering in a cold barn outside Manchester, plotting not violence, but visibility. We only want bread, one says. And to breathe adds another. You find yourself nodding. Of course, the powerful didn't take kindly to this kind of talk. The Luddites smashed machines in protest, convinced the looms were stealing their livelihoods. Newspapers called them madmen thugs, traitors to progress. But when you look closer, it's hard not to sympathize. Imagine working your whole life perfecting a craft, only to watch a machine replace you overnight. Wouldn't you want to smash something too? The government's response was swift and merciless. In 1812, machine breaking became a capital crime punishable by death. Think about that, you could be hanged for destroying the thing that destroyed your job. History has a dark sense of humor. You leave the barn and step into the city again. A crowd gathers in a square, torches flickering in the fog. They're protesting rising food prices, long hours, unsafe mills. Police wait nearby with batons ready. It feels tense, electric. Someone starts singing low, steady, defiant. You don't recognize the tune, but you understand the emotion instantly. It's the sound of people remembering they matter. A man beside you mutters, "Revolutions start like this." You glance at him, half expecting a smile. Instead, he looks tired. Then they end with the same people in different hats, he adds, and takes another drag from his pipe. You don't know whether to laugh or sigh. But not all resistance came from riots. Some came from pen and paper. Writers like Charles Dickens began to tell the truth out loud. Oliver Twist, Hard Times North and South novels that turned the grime of the working class into stories respectable people couldn't ignore. Dickens didn't invent sympathy, but he made it fashionable. You imagine him walking these very streets, notebook in hand, scribbling down the world's injustices between puffs of coal dust. Reform took time, decades really, but it began here with those voices in the smoke. The first trade unions formed cautious at first, then bolder. Meetings were held in secret rooms above bakeries and pubs. They passed around coins for strike funds, shaking hands like conspirators in a spy novel. Every handshake felt like defiance. Then came the rallies, tens of thousands marching peacefully, carrying banners that read, "Fair wages for fair work and the rights of man." The police tried to break them up. The press called them agitators. But something irreversible had begun. Once people taste their own power, they never forget the flavor. You think of the word solidarity. It sounds simple, even gentle, but here it's revolutionary. It means the weaver cares if the miner gets paid. It means the mill girl and the blacksmith are on the same side. It's the first whisper of democracy outside of politics, the idea that ordinary people might run the world they built. Of course, the world didn't change overnight. Laws were slow. Factory owners found loopholes faster than Parliament found pens. But the idea stuck. The unions grew louder, stronger, more organized. They learned to negotiate, to strike, to vote. The machine that once chewed through lives began to face resistance not from sabotage, but from solidarity. And as you walk home through the fog, you catch yourself smiling. The city still stinks. The air still chokes. But now beneath the grime, something new hums, hope maybe. The kind that doesn't need gears or steam. Just people brave enough to say no. You look up at the sky. It's still gray, but a little lighter than before. For the first time in a long time, you think maybe the smoke won't last forever. You wake to the sound of steel wheels screaming against iron rails. And suddenly, the world feels enormous. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how people worked. It changed where they could go, what they could conquer, what they could own. The same smoke that darkened cities also drifted across oceans. If factories were the heart of the New Age empire, was its outstretched arm. The British Empire, once a patchwork of colonies, now hums like a global machine. Steamships plow through seas that once took months to cross, bringing back tea, cotton, sugar, and something less tangible control. You stand on a dock in Liverpool, watching cranes hoist crates stamped Calcutta, Canton, Cape Coast. The air smells of tar salt and profit. Dock workers shout over the hiss of steam, their words drowned by engines louder than any prayer. The irony hits you. The same coal dust coating your boots here also powers the locomotives in India, the textile mills in Egypt, and the gunboats along the African coast. Empire runs on the same fuel as the factory greed refined into progress. The sun may never set on the British Empire, but the smoke sure never clears. You meet a young man in a Navy uniform, polishing a brass pipe. "We're bringing civilization," he says, proudly nodding toward the ships. You smile faintly. Civilization, it seems, has a peculiar definition, one measured in tons of export. Tea, silk, opium, he recites, as if naming saints. You want to ask if he's ever wondered what the people on the other end think about being civilized at gunpoint. But you don't. You already know the answer. Factories back home rely on raw materials from everywhere else. Cotton from India, rubber from Malaya, copper from Africa, all extracted by hands that will never touch the finished goods. You imagine a girl in Bengal, spinning thread for shirts she'll never wear her life, tied by the same fibers that keep Manchester's looms turning. Globalization, you realize, isn't new. It's just gotten better at hiding its price tags. The industrialists call it progress, politicians call it destiny, and poets call it the burden of civilization. You'd call it what it is, outsourcing suffering. Every steam engine that puffs triumphantly down a British track runs on the invisible labor of millions overseas. The world's wealthiest empire is built on someone else's exhaustion. Even the railways themselves become instruments of empire. In India, tracks stretch across the subcontinent, connecting ports to plantations, mines to markets. Locals are told the trains will bring prosperity, but the trains mostly bring goods outward, not inward. You picture a line of workers laying rails in the blazing sun, unaware that the very thing they're building is a chain. Meanwhile, in Africa, explorers and merchants follow the same routes as missionaries, their Bibles and rifles packed side by side. Factories in Birmingham produce the guns. Factories in Bristol produce the chains. Both are sold as tools of progress. The pattern becomes hard to ignore. The more efficient industry becomes the more efficiently it exports inequality. Back in London, Parliament debates the moral duty of empire. The speeches sound noble, but you've seen what morality looks like in practice. Sugar plantations worked to exhaustion, opium wars fought in the name of free trade mines, where men vanish into darkness for metal that gleams on dinner tables. Progress apparently tastes best when it's someone else's sweat that salts it. You pass a newsboy shouting headlines. New trade treaty with China, British industry booms. The boy can't be more than 10. He waves the paper proudly, unaware that the treaty he's selling headlines for was signed at cannon point. History loves its euphemisms. Conquest becomes commerce theft, becomes trade and exploitation, becomes opportunity. Still, amid the empire's triumph, you spot cracks forming. Voices like that of Edmund Burke, who warned that empire without conscience rots from within. Or the poet William Blake muttering about dark, satanic mills that turn men into cogs. Or even a young Karl Marx scribbling furiously in the British Museum, convinced he's deciphering the logic behind all this madness. You can almost see him now, glasses fogged, ink-stained hands trembling, muttering, "They're making profit there, God." He wasn't wrong, and yet the allure of progress is intoxicating. Steamships slice across oceans, telegraphs hum messages faster than horses can gallop, and London lights up like a galaxy. Who wouldn't want to believe it's all worth it? Standing beneath the glowing gas lamps of Piccadilly, you might even convince yourself the world is improving. But then you remember the girl in Bengal, the miner in Congo, the laborer in Manchester. And the thought flickers out like a lamp starved of air. It's strange how empire and industry share the same heartbeat. Both begin with ambition, both end with control. One turns people into workers, the other turns nations into resources. And both, when running smoothly, make it easy to forget they ever ran on human lives. As you watch the steamships vanish into the horizon, their smoke merging with the sunset, you wonder what the world would look like if all that smoke could speak. Would it whisper guilt or pride? Maybe both. Because progress, for all its marvels, always leaves a shadow. And this one stretches across continents. You stand at the edge of a city that hums like a dying machine, its smoke curling into a sky the color of regret. The Industrial Revolution is ending, at least in name. But its echoes still vibrate in every brick, every gear, every heartbeat that learned to keep time with the whistle. The world has changed so completely that even silence feels mechanical now. You walk through the streets as factories begin to shudder for the night. Their windows glow faintly like exhausted eyes. The ground beneath your boots thrums with the ghosts of engines still cooling. The workers have gone home, or what passes for home, and the city for once feels still. You listen carefully. You can almost hear the past catching its breath. It's strange how quickly humans adapt. Once the sound of a loom or a piston was unbearable. Now it's the absence that feels wrong. The machine became a lullaby, the smoke a kind of sky, the schedule a rhythm too deep to unlearn. You realize the Industrial Revolution didn't just build a new world, it rewired the human soul to crave momentum. You turn a corner and find yourself in a small park, one of the few green patches left. The grass struggles through ash, but it's there defiant. Children play with hoops and wooden toys, their laughter oddly fragile in the smog. You wonder if they know that only a generation ago children like them were sweeping chimneys and feeding looms. Probably not. History forgets fast when the soot settles. One man on a bench tips his hat to you. He's older, face lined like a road map of hard years. Used to work the mills, he says, voice rasped by dust. They called it progress, didn't they? You nod. He chuckles dryly. Funny thing about progress, it never asks if you're coming along. He leans back, eyes closing, and for a moment, you can almost see his memories flicker behind his eyelids. Gears sweat, whistles, paydays, funerals. The rhythm of an age that promised heaven and delivered overtime. You keep walking. A brass plaque catches your eye in memory of the workers who built this city. You run your fingers over the engraved names, hundreds of them. No titles, no ranks. Just names. It feels heavy in your chest, the quiet acknowledgement of all the hands that held up the machine. You think back to the children crawling under looms, the women burning in match factories, the men swallowed by furnaces, and wonder what would they say if they saw your world now. You picture showing them a modern city, glass towers, electric lights, cars gliding silently across asphalt. No smoke, no soot, no ash. But look closer, and you'd still find their fingerprints on everything. Every skyscraper is just a taller factory, every algorithm a quieter machine. Progress didn't end, it just learned to hum in a different key. You stop beside a bridge overlooking the river. Once black, it now runs clearer, though not clean. The water glints under the lamps like tarnished silver. Factories line its banks still, but fewer. Now their chimneys replaced by antennas. The reflection of the city dances across the surface, shimmering, distorted, like memory itself. It's easy to romanticize this age, to call it heroic visionary. And in many ways it was. It gave the world the steam engine, the telegraph, the light bulb, the train, the factory clock. It built nations, connected continents, and proved that human ingenuity could rival nature's force. But it also proved something darker, that power without conscience multiplies. Suffering faster than invention multiplies comfort. You think about how people today complain of burnout, of being cogs in systems too large to understand. And suddenly, it doesn't sound so modern at all. The factory whistle may have gone silent, but the pressure remains. The machines just glow softer. Now a fit neatly into your pocket, whispering updates instead of grinding gears. Different century, same hunger. Somewhere a church bell tolls midnight. The sound lingers soft, almost mournful. You imagine it ringing for all that was gained and all that was lost. The Industrial Revolution gave humanity speed, but it stole its breath. Gave wealth, but took wonder. Gave connection, but erased quiet. And yet here you are, walking through its ashes, breathing its legacy with every inhale. You pause under a flickering street lamp, watching the smoke thin into night air. The city stretches before you, still alive, still restless. You can almost hear the faint hum of electricity beneath the cobblestones, as if the ghosts of engines never really left. Maybe they haven't. Maybe the machine isn't something humanity built. Maybe it's something humanity became. Still amid the iron and exhaustion, something undeniable emerged: resilience. The same species that blackened its own sky also learned to fight back, to build unions, to demand rights, to dream bigger. Out of soot came conscience. Out of noise came voice. You take one last look at the horizon, the old factories silhouetted against the fading glow, and you whisper to no one in particular, "We built this. We survived it." The wind carries the words away, scattering them across rooftops, down alleyways, over the quiet river that once ran black. Tomorrow the city will wake again, lighter perhaps, but never clean of its history. The smoke may fade, but the story stays a reminder that every bright future casts a shadow. And sometimes the hardest part of progress isn't making the machine run. It's remembering what it cost to start it. So now as the last factory light dims and the city exhales its tired smoke, you close your eyes. The hum of engines fades to a soft lullaby, the clatter of progress slowing to peace. Breathe in the quiet, just the heartbeat of history beneath your dreams. Sleep